Well, hello, good evening, everyone. I hope I can make my talk as interesting as Brian's. This is the story, isn't it? This is the story of a painting I inherited, and the many hours I have spent trying to establish the identity of the young girl. Miss Snow, as she was then called, was somehow related to my family, but no one could explain where her name fitted into the family tree. There were no Snows amongst my family's forebears, so how did she acquire this name? Who was the artist? But most importantly, who was she, and how did she spend so long in the Levant? My first memory of Miss Snow was when I was finally reunited with my father's family. My parents separated when I was a small child, and I didn't see my father's family home in Greece again until I was 17. Miss Snow hung in the drawing room of my grandparents' beautiful house in Kifisia. Now, can I press the top one?
Down.
Oh, sorry. This is the only photograph I could find that's just been built. And this is the view from the garden, from the house over the garden about 10 years later, so you can see how lovely it was. I learned from my grandfather, William Blackler, that the portrait of Miss Snow had been passed down my family through the maternal line in Smyrna for want of a male heir. What we did know was that Miss Snow was the wife of a Swiss merchant named David Duveluz, whose sister was my 5 times great-grandmother, a lady called Mary Judith Duveluz. Interestingly, her daughter, Louisa Frances Perrinet, married Ralph Gould, a famous London clockmaker who specialized in watches for the Turkish market. I'm very fortunate to have inherited one of these watches, which is now in full working condition. In fact, I only got it yesterday morning at 7 in the morning. It's been quite a tussle getting it in. There it is. It's just been heavily restored. Well, not heavily, beautifully restored. At that time, I was still at school and studying for my A-levels, one of which was the history of art and architecture. My dream was to be accepted by the prestigious Courtauld Institute in London and study the subject under its charismatic director Sir Anthony Blunt, the surveyor of the Queen's pictures, and soon to be the 5th man in the Cambridge 5 spying scandal headed by Burgess and Maclean. Family tradition held that Miss Snow was an early work of Joshua Reynolds, who is considered to be one of the greatest English portrait artists of the 18th century. In fact, I did go to the Courtauld and studied under Blunt, and it was confirmed that Miss Snow was not by Reynolds. At least 10 years after I inherited Miss Snow, I had been on one of my frequent visits to my Aunt Daphne, who had moved back to Athens. On this occasion, she had to rest a great deal following a back injury, and we spent many hours together discussing the family history, which she knew well. Discussing Miss Snow, she suddenly recalled seeing her mourning ring among her jewellery. Oops, there it is. It's quite difficult to decipher, but you have to believe me. So discussing Miss Snow, she suddenly recalled, and she suddenly recalled seeing her mourning ring among her jewellery. Inscribed inside the ring, we found the words, Sarah Duveluz died 19th of March, 1781, aged 37. This was one of my eureka moments. I had a Christian name for Miss Snow. I decided then to switch my research to her husband, David Duveluz. I found confirmation that David was a Swiss merchant who had settled in London. He had a flourishing business with the Levant, and with Smyrna in particular. In 1760, David Duveluz successfully petitioned the House of Lords for naturalization. His name features in several contemporary documents. The UK and US directories, 1680 to 1830, described his business between the years 1761 and 1796 as Turkey Merchant Commerce. In 1761 he lived at Mr. Richardson's, Little Bell Alley, Coleman Street, London. By 1774 he had moved to 14 Size Lane, Budge Row, London. In 1777 his company became Duvaloos & Co. and was listed in a wide variety of directories. There's a long list of directories which mention his company, including a book on Jones's English System of Bookkeeping by single and double entry. Clearly David Duvaloos was keen to be listed everywhere. Several years ago, I came across a very interesting Italian website owned by a certain Matteo Giunti, who was compiling a list of every foreign company that had traded historically within the Italian city of Livorno, which was Leghorn then, which included David Duvaloos & Co. Having tried unsuccessfully myself to find more information about Sarah Duvaloos, Matteo Giunti had discovered the Duvaloos marriage certificate, which finally yielded the information I had been searching for so unsuccessfully. The bride was a lady called Sarah Lee. I was interested to see they were married in Manchester Cathedral on the 10th of March, 1768. Another 3 years passed before I could see the actual certificate online. There were two interesting facts. One was the name of a witness, John Lee, who was most probably her father. The second was that the marriage license had come from the Archbishop of Canterbury. Initially, this suggested that the family had connections within the church. However, I have recently found a document entitled The Proceedings of the Huguenot Society of London online. On the 4th of November, 1761, there was a meeting and David Duvaloos appears as a signatory, being one of the 10 messieurs within the society approving the building of a new church and school in East London. That's it. As a Huguenot, David Duvaloos might have needed a dispensation to marry within the Church of England. However, one of David and Sarah's daughters, Lee Abigail Duvaloos, also had a license from the Archbishop of Canterbury on her marriage certificate, although to my knowledge the Duvaloos family regularly worshipped at St. Stephen Walbrook, one of Christopher Wren's most beautiful churches in the city of London, suggesting that the family were members of the Church of England. That's St. Stephen Walbrook. This church holds the records of births and baptisms of all 7 of David and Sarah's children, and also some of the deaths and burials, including that of Sarah Lee herself at the age of 37. A marriage at Manchester Cathedral suggested that the Lee family was of some importance. I found out that they were based at Coton Hall, near Bridgnorth, in what is now Shropshire, and had large estates. That looks quite small. In fact, there's the chapels in the foreground, which is a ruin, and the house is actually a square, rounding a central sort of area, I think. So it's quite grand. A fairly recent discovery was finding a large painting of the Lee family, which used to hang at Coton Hall, and is now in the Wolverhampton Art Gallery. There we are. The artist was Joseph Highmore, and it is signed and dated. The gallery also owns 2 further portraits of Elizabeth Lee, the wife of William Waller. A portrait of the young Elizabeth is strikingly like my painting of Sarah Lee and appears to be by the same artist. There we are. You can see by the gestures, by the fact that she's holding a bouquet of flowers, the way she points her hands, and the application of paint. I think it's very similar. Joseph Highmore is an interesting artist. He was born in London and practiced initially as a lawyer before abandoning the law to become a full-time painter. In 1714 he became a pupil of the court painter Godfrey Kneller and was later appointed court painter to the royal family. There's a very fine portrait of Princess Adelaide in the royal collection. A portrait of Highmore's daughter illustrates how skilled a portraitist he could be. That is his daughter Susanna on the right, and this is a self-portrait. Interesting, I think. Very slender little chap. When he died, Highmore was buried in the south aisle of Canterbury Cathedral. It is said that Highmore painted several portraits of the Lee family and became a friend of Eldred Lancelot and his wife Isabella Gough. and regularly stayed at Coton Hall. Now, having your portrait painted indicates social status, and commissioning several paintings might reflect landed wealth. It seems very likely that Sarah is part of this Lee family, especially as Highmore is said to have painted several other portraits of the family. There's a lot to say about the Lee family, who were indeed a wealthy Shropshire family. Eldred Lancelot Lee had business connections with the East Indies, and being part of the business community, it's likely that he knew David Duvaliers in London. Both he and his brother Thomas were benchers at Lincoln's Inn, while his father had also been a barrister there. Also, as already mentioned, Joseph Highmore had worked as a lawyer, having taken a 7-year clerkship with an attorney. Apparently his studio was also nearby. A branch of the Lees emigrated to the United States. A certain Richard Lee was baptized in October 1653 at Coton Hall, and according to his great-grandson, Colonel Thomas Henry Lee, he arrived in Virginia in 1616. The Honourable Thomas Henry Lee was a leading political figure in Virginia. In 1723, he became a member of the House of Burgesses. In 1733, he was appointed to the Governor's Council in the Virginia General Assembly. He founded the Ohio Company of Virginia with fellow Virginian colonialists who wanted to expand the state's territory into the Ohio River Valley by negotiating with the Six Nations of the Iroquois at the Treaty of Lancaster. In 1749, he became the de facto governor of Virginia in place of the absent former governor. Two of his sons, Richard Henry Lee and Francis Lightfoot Lee, were signatories to the Declaration of American Independence. Robert E. Lee, a direct descendant, was famous for commanding the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia in the American Civil War. In a letter written by Lancelot Lee to his American cousin Thomas, it is clear that Lancelot had travelled to the east, and most probably to Smyrna, where we know from Hyde Clark's History of the British Colony at Smyrna, a talk given to the British Museum in 1862, that there was a Lee house in the powerful Levant Company. There exists a portrait of the Honourable Thomas Lee, painted again by Joseph Highmore in 1736. Reading about the family, you realise that it was a common occurrence for citizens, at least in Virginia, to move back to the home county, whether for their children to receive an English education, or for business reasons, or maybe to see the family. They also travelled to distant places, as we read in Lancelot's letter. From Hyde Clark we learned that the English merchants in Smyrna were returning regularly to England to obtain their freedom of the Levant Company in order to function within the local government. In 1776 there was a Richard Lee who was the head of the firm of Lee and Maltas in Smyrna. He also mentions, quote, the well-known John Lee, and also the firm of William and Richard Lee in London. Now, I'm wondering whether this John Lee could be Sarah's father, but I haven't been able to prove it yet. To return to my story in England, once they were married, David and Sarah Duvaliers moved to London and lived somewhere in Highgate. In the next 13 years of her short life, she gave birth to 7 children, 3 sons and 4 daughters. We know that they lived in Highgate because her death was recorded at St. Stephen Walbrook as follows. 26th of March was buried Sarah Duvaliers in the South Aisle, below the cross he brought from Highgate, aged 37 years. St. Stephen Walbrook was badly damaged during the Blitz, and when I visited the church, the whole floor and most of the walls had been rebuilt. There was no sign of the cross mentioned in the death register or her tomb. Peter Emmanuel was the only son of David and Sarah to survive into adulthood. He went into the family business with his father David. He married a lady called Marianne Zimmerman, who is buried at All Saints Church, Smyrna. Unfortunately, there were no children from this marriage. According to Hyde Clark, Peter Duvaliers was admitted in 1792 as a member of the Levant Company. He arrived in Smyrna in November of 1793 and was in business by 1794. Smyrna was the most important commercial city for the Levant Company. Peter Duvaliers was just in time to be affected by the Napoleonic Wars, when French frigates blockaded Smyrna for 2.5 years. leaving in January 1796. French frigates were in Smyrna again in 1797. However, by September 1798, the French factory and other property were put under civil arrest by the Sultan, and on the 1st of October they were sequestered and imprisoned. The news of Nelson's victory at the Battle of the Nile meant that the English at last were free to trade again. However, a disastrous fire in Smyrna in August 1798 destroyed many of the warehouses. It was perhaps the fire of 1797 and 2.5 years of the French blockade which damaged the family business. Could Peter Duvaloux have been involved with the Lee house, seeing that his mother was a Lee? These questions are frustrating and intriguing and need more research into the Levant Company. Some years later, in 1860, there are 2 documents from the English court, one of which declares Peter Duvaloux as a bankrupt, while the second one states that his business interests had returned to normal. According to High Clark, 31 men and women of British nationality established in Smyrna were requested to be indemnified in 1798 by the British government for their losses during the fire that had destroyed the city a year before. Among these were John Lee and Peter Duvaloux. It's possible that the problems in Smyrna and the death of his father in 1808 were good reasons to give up his business interests and start a new life in the diplomatic service. Peter was appointed consul in Adrianopolis, which is now Edirne, in 1819 and again in 1824. And according to the publication, The Consular Officials in the Ottoman Empire and its former territories from the 16th century to about 1860, he died there in 1832. Now Sarah Lee, wait a minute. Sarah Lee died in 1781. I think it's likely that her portrait remained with her husband David until his death in 1808. It's difficult to say exactly what happened after this. My grandfather, William Blackler, told me that Peter Manuel was very fond of his first cousin's granddaughter, Louise Gould. Louise Gould was my great-great-grandmother, and at some point she acquired the painting. But why was she called Miss Snow? Now, while writing this talk, I have stumbled across information which I think solves the mystery. On being appointed His Majesty's Consul at Adrianopolis, my guess is that Peter gave the painting into the safekeeping of his sister Lee Duvaloux in England, as he was then living in Smyrna. In 1806, Lee Duvaloux married a Dr. Bernard Geary Snow, a wealthy and successful doctor and apothecary who lived in Highgate. The license came from the Archbishop of Canterbury again. Snow is mentioned in the Gentleman's Gazette several times. He was particularly interested in fossils and wrote a paper on the fossils of London clay, which he gave as a lecture to the Geological Society, where he was a member. Lee Snow died in 1818. I think that it is possible that the portrait remained with the Snow family for a considerable period while Peter was working in Edirne, and possibly even until his death in 1832. There must have been a strong bond between Peter and his sister, seeing that she named her youngest son after him. He was named Peter Duvaloux Snow. This could account for my family's ignorance as to the identity of Sarah Lee, and calling her Miss Snow, as the portrait would have been shipped out to Smyrna from the Snow family, possibly after his death in 1832, and into the possession of Louise Gould, some 50 years after his mother Sarah had died. There's Louise Gould and her husband, William Griffith. Louise Gould came from a French Huguenot family. She was the daughter of John Albert Abraham Gould and Mary Firkin, and was born in Smyrna in 1815. She was a feisty lady and stood up to the Turkish irregulars who attacked the family summer house outside Bujar. Old family photos show the household drying masses of grapes, possibly for the dried fruit trade. She succeeded in routing these men with some stinging oratory along the lines of, "You call yourself men? Aren't you ashamed of attacking defenseless women? Are you cowards?" Later she contracted typhoid and was nursed by her youngest daughter, Elfrida. Tragically, although Louise recovered, her daughter died. Louise married William Griffith. who was born in Malta in April 1814. His father was in the British Army, which fought in the Egyptian campaign against Napoleon. He settled in Malta. William came to Smyrna looking for work and started to work for the Gu family, who were carpet merchants. He was employed first as a junior clerk, married the daughter Louise, and eventually took over the business. William and Louise's only son, John, Robert, is said to have died from TB. John was very knowledgeable about the carpet trade and wrote a short booklet on the subject of Turkey carpets. Oops. Oh, there's so. Turkey carpets and their manufacturer's sketch. If you inside, there's nothing in it which says it was written by John, except in the introduction here. This booklet on the subject of Turkey carpets contained his own photographs for the benefit of English and American clients of their dealers in London and Boston. William and Louise Griffith still had two surviving daughters. The elder one, Harriet, never married, and consequently Miss Snow went to the second daughter, Mary, who married Francis Blackler in Smyrna in January 1884. Frank, as he was known, was the only son of Francis Chipman Blackler and his wife Annie Sophia Routh. That's the name. The Blacklers were wealthy American. Oh, he had 6 sisters. The Blacklers were wealthy American citizens and traded between Boston, Liverpool, Smyrna, and China. He was sent to boarding school in England, somewhere in Highgate, until his father had a fatal heart attack on hearing that his brother, who ran the American side of the business, had somehow bankrupted them all. Frank had to return to Smyrna. That's Frank and his wife Mary. Frank had to return to Smyrna to support his mother and sisters. Like his future father-in-law before him, he joined William Griffith and Company Limited with carpet merchants and learnt the business. There's a photo of the family inside the Blackler house, which is located almost opposite the entrance to the Anglican Church of All Saints, Boujar. Mary, his wife, was an accomplished artist, intelligent, tall, pretty, and according to my aunt, a bit of a snob. When John Griffith died, Frank took over the family business. Miss Snow stayed in the family home until the fire of Smyrna in 1922. After the problems and civil unrest had abated, Frank returned to Boujar and found that the servants had looked after the house well. From Smyrna, the family moved to Athens and eventually built a house in Ephesia. At some point, the painting was damaged and it was shipped to the Louvre in Paris, where it was repaired and cleaned before being sent to her new home with the Blackler family in Greece. My grandfather, William, was the last of my family in line to inherit Miss Snow before me. He was Frank and Mary's only child. He had survived a typhoid epidemic, and his mother refused to let her darling boy go to school abroad. He was tutored privately at home. He studied zoology at Trinity College, Oxford, when it was a fledgling subject. His tutor became director of the Natural History Museum and asked William to look out for new species in Turkey. Grandpa did find at least 2 new species of mammal. I can't remember what the other one was. I think it was a fox, one of which was a gerbil, and then he was very old. Whilst at university, William was asked to write an article about the recently discovered tomb of the Blessed Virgin Mary at Ephesus, which appeared in the magazine The Treasury in 1907. He was a man of many talents. He spoke English, French, Turkish, and Greek. At 6'5", he was exceptionally tall, handsome, loved history, classical works, archaeology, photography. Photos show the family on picnics or excursions near Smyrna, protected by armed guards. Whoops, sorry. I thought it might be sensible just to put a little bit up to, I don't know if you're getting confused by all these people. You've got David Dubelou's there, who married, who was the brother of Mary Juliet, who married, and he comes down here to the Gus, and then the Gus came down to the Griffiths, which came down to the Blacklers. Well, that's about it, really. That's my grandfather with his gun, of course, and his horse. Right. William was very proud of his American heritage. The first William Blackley is mentioned in Marblehead in 1660, while his wife's father, John Codner, was born in Marblehead in 1625, 5 years before the arrival of the Mayflower. There he is with his wife, my grandmother. But Valerie, is that how you pronounce it? Valerie? His English wife came from a family in love with Turkey. Her uncle had been Lord Mayor of London when the Turkish Sultan Abdulaziz visited the city in the summer of 1867. He was treated lavishly, and in return, oops, sorry, this is a picnic Smyrna sound. Do you see the gun? He was treated lavishly in London, and in return, her family were given laissez-passer with the Sultan's command that they should receive every courtesy on their visits. Valide, which I understand means mother of the Sultan, is that right? And her younger brother Osman were given Turkish names. Var, she was called, was tall and fair, with a great sense of humour, and an enormous ability to recite reams of poetry. When she was displeased with the Greek servants, she couldn't speak Greek, she would launch into Tennyson's The Charge of the Light Brigade with a strong delivery, terrorising everyone. During the Second World War, the family escaped from the invading Germans to Alexandria and then later to South Africa. The house in Kafissia then became the residence of the German High Command in Greece. Only senior officers were allowed to stay there. Fortunately, they cared for the house. Miss Snow survived the experience. Oh, sorry, Sarah Lee, well, she was Miss Snow then. Survived the experience, although one of 2 chairs were chopped up for firewood, as the winters can be very cold in Greece. Following the death of my grandfather, in 1969, Miss Snow remained in the family home which was rented out until the premature death of my father in 1980. I inherited the painting in 1983 and shipped her home to London. So ended her travels in the Levant, which covered approximately 150 years. She has finally returned to Highgate, where she now hangs in our home and is, at long last, called by her rightful name, Sarah Lee. Thank you very much.
So we've got time for questions to the speakers, if anyone has anything, and would you be happy to take them as they come?
Yes.
Yes.
Val, did you have to have you said the picture had been restored or
Yes.
prepared in the Louvre. Did you have to have it restored and cleaned again here in London?
Well, I have just had it cleaned about 2 years ago, which showed that she was carrying a little bouquet of blue flowers, which we hadn't seen before.
Oh, so it was quite a radical clean.
But no, it wasn't actually. It was just that you couldn't see the blue before.
Yes.
I was hoping that the landscape on the left would show up more, but apparently you have to pay extra for that. They do the portrait, and if you wanted a good background, you have to pay a whole lot more. Yes.
Do you have any explanation or comment on the bottom of the sleeves?
Did everyone hear the question?
The lace.
No, not the lace, the band with some form of decoration on it above.
Just above the,
Oh,
the
yes.
elbow.
No,
just
I
above
don't,
the
actually.
elbow, that, yes.
I don't know what that is. I think it's just some sort of form of decoration, isn't it? I wish I knew who her father was. I'm beginning to think it might be this John Lee in Smyrna, because they were all muddled up together. But haven't got any proof yet.
Yes, you said it wasn't a Joshua Reynolds.
Yes.
Is it?
It's Joseph Highwall.
It is
Oh, yes,
definitely
very
him.
definitely. Yes.
Well, yes, I mean that's quite a painter as well. So.
Yes. Yes. Especially as the Lee family apparently had a lot of portraits painted by him. But she doesn't fit into the group photographs that I showed you, I tried very hard, but she doesn't fit into there. None of the sons well, the dates aren't right, and the only one who could have, well, it's just impossible. I've looked everywhere. And I've recently come across a book written by a member of the Lee family, who married it, and she's looking down everything that she knows about the family, all the papers, all the birth certificates, all the letters back to America, back again. For some people in America to say that they don't think that the American Lees came from this family, but the one I referred to Thomas, and she writes, when he writes back to his cousin, he said, "Would you please tell me who all my Lee ancestors are in Coats and Hall?" And he sits down and he names them all. So I think there's no doubt about it that it's a very interesting family, actually.
But it's an expert who actually certified the fact that it's a highborn. Or, well, it's not signed.
No, it's not
otherwise
signed.
you would have known.
But
And because the family was painted by him,
Yes.
a lot of these were painted.
Yes.
So you assume that.
Well,
it
also
is
because the
highborn.
style is typical.
Right.
Actually. I showed it actually to, I was at the court, the expert on Hogarth got quite excited by it. Came rushing around, oh, so early. But when he saw it, he said, no, not good enough.
Any questions? Any questions from? Yes.
It's for Brian. And by the way, I want to say that you talked about the reception for Abdulaziz in London. There'll be the opportunity to hear some of that music on the 27th of November at the Cadogan Hall when Emery Arachi is organising a concert of Western music for Ottoman Sultans. For Brian, is there any evidence of how Antoine van der Steen went from the household of the Celsing ambassadors of Sweden to that of Sir Robert Ainsley, ambassador of England, who obviously it was his property, more or less?
No, I'm
from my family.
No, well, I've looked obviously, and there's nothing. I mean, I've gone through the when Ainsley's estates was wound up and auctioned. I've been through that. I've been through an agent who's actually looked at the estate of the last surviving member of the Ainsley family. There's nothing there either. So as far as I know, Van der Steen didn't didn't produce any paintings for Ainsley, and yet Ainsley refers in his own words to the fact that he was debauched out of his family by George Baldwin. It was an unusual way of expressing what presumably happened, and that's as far as I know. So we've got fixed dates of 1768 to 1771 for him being artist in residence to the Celsing family. The next definite date is 1780, when he set out for India with Baldwin, and that's confirmed obviously by the correspondence between Sir Robert Ainsley and the Foreign Office correspondent. So we know that, but nothing more than that, I'm afraid, at the moment.
How many of his paintings have you managed to track down?
That's an interesting question. I'm just trying to think of how many there are. Do you remember how many that there are at all?
Well,
I think that about
but it's not certain they're all by him.
well, this is part of the problem. You see that there are only one or two that are signed by Van der Steen. The rest are anonymous or deemed to be anonymous. They're only thought to be Van der Steen on the basis of their similarity to the two signed paintings. That's all. And in fact, I've been in some considerable correspondence with Sotheby's about this very same matter, because Sotheby's produced a brochure of the Celsing collection, and the author, Andrew Fletcher, nominated what he thought to be by Van der Steen. and others which he thought were in fact possibly but not likely, and therefore he's described them as the school of Constantinople. Now I'm convinced that all the paintings that the Sotheby's have seen from the Celestine collection are by Van der Steen. But of course I can say that, can't I? But Andrew Fletcher, a senior director of Sotheby's, can't, and that is the problem. But if my paper is ever published on Van der Steen, we'll see what the outcomes can be. But I'm sticking my neck out that all that's in the collection at the moment that are attributed to Van der Steen are in fact by Van der Steen, despite the poor condition of some of them.
If I may, the paintings from India, did they come from a regimental collection? Was there a tradition of having sort of painters with the army?
There was. I mean, artists were often employed by the military to provide topographical sketches for subsequent campaigns, and Van der Steen's skill as a draftsman, I've feeling that in fact he was a highly skilled draftsman. I think he may have had some training as a draftsman as opposed to simply just daubing paint on canvas. That in fact he was employed in that regard, and it's no coincidence, I think, that all the 4 paintings that are by him or attributed to him contain faults.
And were any from a regimental collection?
They're at the moment. I think most of them, if not all of them, are at the at the British Museum, Department of Indian paintings or whatever. Yeah. But we don't know, unfortunately, how he died, where he died. It's just a note in a compendium of officers who worked for or employed by the Bengal artillery, and that's how I found him eventually. I mean, it was said earlier on that he in fact died in Bengal, and of course there were 3 British armies operating in India at that particular time, of which Bengal was one, and they, like the Bombay artillery, kept a detailed account of all the officers that they in their employ. And there wasn't anything like Van der Steen or even Mr. Stone in the Bengal army. But in the Bombay artillery, there he was.
Excellent, thank you. Any more questions? No? Well, there'll be a chance for those who are staying to dinner to chat later. So I'm just going to wrap up and just say a big thank you to our speakers, and if you'll just join me in sort of thanking them.